Well, today on Dylan Talks Tone, we're going to talk about soldering. So this has been a really requested video. And actually, we did a couple videos on this before, but we're gonna talk, we did a video about the soldering gear that we use, like the equipment that we use, but there's not a lot on the internet that is very specific about soldering for guitar components. So we're gonna talk about what we do here at Dylan Talks Tone. We're going to put together a Telecaster control plate today, and we're going to show you some little tips and stuff about soldering, because there's some kind of misconceptions about what we need to do and some shortcuts maybe that, because people are doing stuff that you don't necessarily need to do. I'm just going to tell you. So let's go ahead and get into building this Telecaster control plate. This will give us some solid concepts about stuff that we can use to solder on our guitars. Most of the videos on the internet, a lot of them have to do with like surface mount soldering for chips and stuff. Obviously that's not what we do around here anymore. So let's get right into it. Let's go over some basic stuff. We need a capable soldering iron. We have one here. We will leave links in the description of this video for everything that we have here, so that you can put together kind of a, a really reliable soldering rig for not a lot of money. I mean, under $100. It would probably under 50 bucks actually. So we'll put links to some proper stuff that I think you'll really dig. So a proper soldering iron. I use this Hakko solder tip cleaning mesh. Okay, so you go like that, and your tip stays clean. I don't like using, of course this has a sponge place here, but I don't like using the sponge because over time it kind of rusts your tips. We use Kester solder. Here's a thing about solder. You can get super nerdy about the percentages and stuff. Just get 60-40 rosin core solder. There's going to be some tone freaks that are going to say blah, 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 blah about other percentages. Man, it's a guitar. There's 300 millivolts here. Don't worry about it. Just use regular 60-40 solder. It's not going to hurt anything at all. One of the things that I think where people go wrong and have difficulty, there's two main things. Understanding the actual process of soldering. It's not welding. It's not melting things together. It's actually about heat transfer between components, okay? So we're going to talk about that in a minute, so keep that in mind. The reason I bring that up now is as we look at what we have here, we have two pots, a switch, a capacitor, and a jack. You notice that I have this piece of wood. Literally all this is just a piece of door trim that I tore out of my house doing some remodeling. I drilled 3 holes in it, and now I can put that in there like that, okay? When I am doing cables, I actually have this pedal enclosure with 2 jacks in it so that I can put the plug in it and keep it still. I put some dual lock on the bottom. I have some dual lock on the desk under here on both sides so that I can lock it wherever I want it and keep it still. The reason we bring up this whole holding your work thing is because this is the #1 thing that people have a difficulty with when soldering, and it is because they allow their work to move. The heat transfer is not solid. It is not consistent from one component to the other. So if your capacitor is wiggling around, then the heat transfer is not consistent and you end up with a cold solder, and that is where you have 2 problems. 1, lack of continuity. So a cracked cold solder, or very high resistance in that solder because it's a cold solder, and then you end up with tone problems because of that. So, or non-functioning problems because of that. So keep your work still and make sure that the stuff doesn't move so that you have consistent heat transfer from one component to the other. Let's get actually into soldering these components together, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that concept as we do this. Okay, so I've got the camera set basically exactly how I'm looking at it. So you're basically seeing it from my perspective, more or less. So when we talk about heat transfer, there's a couple of things. One is you want to use enough heat in the iron to make this hot, but you don't want to use enough to do damage to the pots. One of the reasons we use Bourne's pots here is because there's no major mechanism in the back of the pot. So plus I like how they work and their taper and how they feel and all that sort of stuff. But a side benefit of Bourne's is this is just a metal can. There's no centering or location pin in the middle here to become melted, so that when we put all of our grounds on the back of this pot, we don't do any damage. Now this leads me to the very first thing. Some people will say, well, you gotta rough it up with a piece of sandpaper, you gotta do all this kind of stuff. No, you don't. If you have good heat transfer, so first of all, you notice I don't use a chisel tip. That comes from my previous lifetime. I worked with a lot of surface mount stuff and very small components, so I've just gotten used to using a pointed tip. But you'll see that I use the side of the tip, and that will create heat transfer from the tip to the component, okay? I've not put any solder on this yet. We're just trying to get some heat in this thing. And you notice there's even some ink right there. But watch what happens. If good heat transfer is happening, that solder joint just happens, right? And it flows by itself. So let's go ahead and connect our ground to our pot. For our volume. Okay, now what I've done here, it looks messy right now, but actually if we add a little more, now we have a good base for when we go to ground everything else. Now that's where I'm going to ground everything, is that one place. The way I was able to do that was to actually have good heat transfer from the iron to the component. Okay, and then see that? Solder even stuck to it just from the iron. And you're going to say, well, it never does that for me, because there's a few things that can happen. Your solder tip isn't clean, you don't have good heat in your iron, or you are not transferring heat to the component. So you can't transfer a lot of heat like this on the tip. That's why a lot of people use chisel tips. I'm like simulating a chisel tip by laying it down like this. But I like laying it down sideways like this because I can see my work better. And it works really well, and it's a lot more precision, if that makes sense. Now, another place a lot of people have a lot of problems is, let's go ahead and solder this capacitor to the back of this pot. So this is going to be our tone circuit. So what I like to do a lot of times is, let's put this over here, because that's probably going to lay about like that. Now, see this? This is wiggling around in here. The trick with this is, remember we said if you have any motion in your components, you're not going to have good heat transfer between the component. So I like to do something funny, like bend it around like that. Now, you know, obviously it's not going to live like that forever. That's just temporary. But now what we've done is we're holding everything still, and we're holding the component, which is the capacitor, solidly against the eye. So now, when we solder this, we have a solid solder. See, now I take that back out of there, and we'll clip that off in a minute. We have a solid solder. See that? We'll clip that off in just a second. Same thing over here. Bend this in such a way where it holds it to the back of the pot, so where we're not having a bunch of slack in there. Maybe like this. Even I've got a little baby piece of solder. We'll see if it's enough. Again, transfer from the component and the solder to the back of the pot. On the corner is the hardest part, because you need to create the most heat in there. So there we go. All right, so now we've clipped this off. It looks nice and clean. Let's go ahead and move on to our wiring. Same thing here, we've got that wire propped in there so that it's solid and not moving. Get some heat in the component before we add solder. And it's as simple as that. By the time you get everything moved around, you will be cool enough. You're probably watching this and you're thinking, man, it never goes that easily for me. And I will tell you, probably the number one reason it doesn't go that easily for other people is because they allow motion in the components. That is probably the number one thing, is they allow this wire to wiggle. And then, you know, it's like as you have heat on here, you're allowing that wire to move a little bit, because your hands always, you know, we're not shaky like this, but our hand does always move just a little bit, and we cause motion in this, or we allow this to flop around, or a lot of times we don't have a cool tool like a piece of wood, and we're sitting here and we're trying to do it and hold everything, and it's wiggling, and we're not allowing that good heat transfer, and then the next thing you know, we're fighting it instead of having that kind of seamless motion of soldering. So actually soldering isn't too difficult. And like I said, the main reason most people have issues is two things: keeping their work still so that they have good heat transfer between all components being soldered. That's the number one thing. And having a good iron is something that it makes it a whole lot easier. We're gonna go ahead and leave in the comments to this, or the description of this video, we'll leave a list of materials that I think you'll find very, very effective. A good iron, good solder, good tip cleaner, and I think those three things put together, you'll be able to do basically anything in your shop and have good results. If you have any questions about this, or you want to know anything more specific about this particular subject, or anything to do with guitar tone, please let me know in the comments section down below, and we will try to make a video just for you. Do me a favor and subscribe if you like videos like this, or you want to see more like it, or you have an idea. And also check out the stuff we make over there at Dylan Talks Tone. I hope everybody has a great day.